some of the strategies that we've seen from working with dozens and dozens of technical working groups over the last 15 years. Presenting today are myself, Andy Freed. I'm the president of Virtual Incorporated. We're an association management company focusing on the technology standard space. We're based just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, where fortunately today we are enjoying summer weather, which is what we waited for with the payback of this past winter. And joining me today is my colleague Greg Kahn. Greg?
Yep. Hello, everyone. I'm Senior Vice President of Client Services for Virtual. I've worked across a whole bunch of different standards organizations and technical consortia, and a lot of the lessons learned from those experiences are baked into the presentation today.
Thanks, Greg. So between the two of us, we currently work with approximately 40 different organizations that have strong technical presences and technical working groups. So like it or not, being on technical working groups and being on board calls, this is our day job, and where we spend the bulk of our time as a different consortia making these groups work. So without any further ado, we're going to get into some of the strategies that we've seen and some of the directions that we've seen for organizations in making their technical working groups work. And with due respect to David Letterman, we've created this as a top 10 list today. But unlike David, our counting will go up and not down. So number one is that leadership matters, and that it's really important to have a strong chair and very, very solid person who can drive your technical working group and really drive your activity. This doesn't necessarily mean the person who is the most technical and the person who is the most savvy or the person who has the most subject matter expertise. This is about leadership, not about technical skill. And one of the places that we see organizations run into trouble is when they forget that role of the leader. Either they have nobody who's designated as the leader, or they've picked somebody who has a lot of technical savvy but doesn't have the presence and kind of desire to really drive the group. A few other things that we've seen work. One is to bring in a third-party facilitator every now and again. Sometimes you'll see things get bogged down with the group. It's important to have somebody who has no skin in the game who can come to the table and really drive the group's activities. And lastly, leadership training. You'd never set somebody up on a technical tool without training. You'd never set somebody up to do surgery without training. You shouldn't expect that somebody understands how to lead a technical working group without some level of training. And that might be informal training in the form of working with peers and working with other organizations that have done this. It also can be formal training, and there's groups out there like SES, the Standards Engineering Society, that focus on standards development across industry sectors. They often offer training, offer resources that might be great for individuals to use. But the key thing is a group is only as strong as its leader, and not having somebody at the helm is only going to run you into problems.
Yeah, Andy, I would also add that as important as it is to have a strong lead or group chair, it's also important to have good vice chairs across each group. Even the best chairs need time off, or they have work items to tend to, and without a strong vice chair, groups can really just get stuck in the mud. Also, when it's time for a group chair to move on to the next thing, you have a built-in succession plan at that point.
Thanks, Greg. And on the note of training for participants is as important as it is for training for the individuals that are running that are going to be leading the organization. And one of the things that we've seen for some groups is that they'll have a really nice cadence and really nice direction going, and then somebody new joins, and it creates a lot of stress on the organization. It can be stressful for the new participants who are trying to figure out kind of how the organization functions, and it can be stressful for those who have been around a bit who feel that all of a sudden things that were working one way are now working a different way. Think about some kind of an onboarding process for new members, a formal orientation, something which gives them the lay of the land, just tells them the straight logistical operations of the group, where documents are, how things function, what the rules of procedure are, but also tells them some of the backstory on some of the decisions that were made. How did the organization get to the point it is right now? What are the current action items and current items in the work stream? Where have other players come down on items in that work stream? That way you can avoid having, every time a new player joins the group, having it feel like you've hit a reset button. And lastly, think about technology to help you with this process. We've seen some groups that create on-demand videos, just simple training videos on how the systems work, how the technical working group functions. That can be a very easy way to provide more information for folks.
Yeah, we also encourage our standards organizations to conduct orientation or training sessions at each of their face-to-face meetings. It not only reinforces the onboarding process, but it also provides a networking opportunity for the newbies in the group to get together.
Thanks, Greg. Rules of procedure is number 3, and it's very important to have a sense of what your rules are for your organization prior to getting into discussions. And first, the time to set the rules of procedure is early on. Setting rules of procedure once the technical working group has grown in size can be trickier. You have to get the rules established early on, and those rules should scope out things like what are the items that require unanimous consent? What are the items that might require simple majority? Are there some items that require a supermajority vote? Having that type of thing decided very early on is critical. That also helps you with many organizations we've seen have a kind of culture of unanimity that develops, where even if the organization doesn't require unanimous consent on every decision, people just feel bad, and people feel like it would be nice to have everybody on board for this. So somebody disagrees, let's see if we can get them engaged and see what we can do. Well, that's a great idea, but that can also at times thwart the progress of a group if you're not willing to move on based on a 9 out of 10 vote or 19 out of 20 vote, and instead hold out for that last member. The last piece is to also have a sense of where are the policies that require a formal vote, and where are the ones where simple consensus actually might be enough. We've seen some organizations that don't exactly right-size their rules of procedure, where they create rules of procedure that are very stiff, very formal, and will actually bog the organization down, where they'll actually have agreement and have consensus, but now they have to go through a ritual dance of getting the votes, the right notice period, the process in which they do that. And while for some votes that's certainly important and critical, have an understanding of where those moments are and right-size your rules for that.
Yeah, what I would add here is that, like many other governance documents, it's a good idea to review a rules of procedure document on, say, an annual basis. It just makes sure that the document stays in alignment with the ongoing activities of the group, but also that the activities of your organization are in compliance with the rules of procedure. And where there's not compliance, that you take action to make sure that those rules are being followed.
That's a great point. So many organizations set these rules and don't look at them for a long time. So having a process where you review them regularly is so critical. I worked with an organization, not in the technical space years ago, but when I reviewed their bylaws when I first took the job in the mid-90s, the approved way to notify the board of directors on all meetings was via telegraph. It's possible that they both hadn't reviewed that in some time and might have fallen out of compliance with that policy over, let's say, the last 40 years. So looking at those things periodically is certainly critical. Next is agenda setting. And agendas are such a critical part of understanding what your technical working group's up to and making sure the meetings run effectively. A thoughtful agenda process, and that means not just a laundry list of here's the stuff we need to do, but one, making it very clear what the items are on the agenda so that everyone has an understanding of if they should be bringing other resources to the table for the meeting, what's the topic, because a certain topic's being discussed, or if they need to get clarification on something internally because the topic's on there. I never like seeing agendas that just have essentially the items of review minutes, new business, or recover old business, new business. That doesn't really help anybody. Be very clear on what the items are. Also, if possible, have objective statements. We also often formulate agendas so that we will clarify which items on the agenda are a vote is going to be required for this item. This item might be informational only, but having something that makes it very clear what the objective is of each item on the agenda. And then lastly, get the agenda out in advance. Distributing the agenda at 10:55 for an 11 o'clock meeting doesn't give folks the time to prepare and the time to make sure that they've come to the meeting in the right frame of mind.
Yeah, and if there's going to be supporting documents related to the agenda, we also encourage that those go out in a timely manner, but also that those materials are posted to a central location and as much as possible to avoid sending them out over email. We'll talk a little bit about document storage later, but particularly as tied to the agenda, it's a really important item.
Thanks. And number 5, use enhanced meeting tools. So we're all familiar with tools like GoToMeeting, WebEx. These are all great tools that can really drive productivity for a meeting if used properly and if the right tools are used. A few things that I've seen go well and a few things that I've seen go badly. One, if I had all of the time back that I've spent over the last 15 years of doing this, that was spent for the first 11 minutes of every call with somebody trying to figure out how to get WebEx to work, boy, I would have an extra week, a few weeks vacation every year. So make sure that everyone who's on the call is familiar with the tool. Make sure that whoever is driving the tool knows how it works, has had a chance to use it before, and has a chance also to download the latest version. WebEx is known for pushing out the latest update, and now somebody tries to log on, and of course, what are you talking about in the conference call? Oh, darn it, I just logged on, and I'm downloading a WebEx update, and it takes 7 minutes, and now it's going from a 12 o'clock call to 12:07, and everyone's waiting. So make sure somebody's very familiar with those tools. Also, while we're not going to endorse any one tool, I certainly would endorse sticking with the larger providers. Where we've seen things get into trouble is when somebody uses a smaller proprietary solution, and then it's just not compatible with everybody's system. You discover that that tool is blocked on the firewall of some technical companies, and they can't get to it. That tool isn't compatible with what some folks are using. Sticking to the larger platform providers is a much more solid and tried and true way to go. So, Greg, let me turn it to you for number 6.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Andy. So getting to the meeting or a meeting is one piece, and it's a critical piece. But I'm going to talk a little bit in the next few slides about coming out of the meeting and getting results within a working group. A critical component of post-meeting activity is to make sure that action items are tracked and that members and volunteers are held accountable for getting work done. The real life and blood of a working group happens in between meetings. And I've seen time and again, scenario after scenario, where you get onto that next conference call and you're expecting to have deliverables from a number of different members and they just don't arrive because the members have forgotten about it or it hasn't been a priority on their side. So you really need to assign or appoint what I call a chaser within a working group to make sure that those action items and tasks are being done and followed up upon. That can be delegated to staff or it can be delegated to a person within the group. Maybe the chair or vice chair can take those responsibilities. But generally my feeling is if that chaser function is not there, progress really gets stalled. And I would also add that as much as possible, try to get the list of action items and tasks distributed out to your group as soon after the meeting as possible while the ideas and the content of the meeting is still fresh in people's minds.
Yeah, and to Greg's point on sharing these publicly, that's often a great way just to drive results with a call that goes out to somebody right before the next meeting saying, hey, we're going to share the list of open action items. I see your name is on there. I certainly don't want to have that up on the slide in front of everybody. So maybe you can get your work done. It's a great way to kind of nudge things along.
Yeah, the next topic ties into what Andy was talking about a little bit earlier in terms of providing training and onboarding for new participants. And as he mentioned, one of the worst things that can happen within a working group is that as new participants arrive, they reopen topics that have been talked about, at least once or maybe multiple times. That can even happen without new participants, just as people forget that topics have been discussed, or a good amount of time has elapsed between discussions. And what we like to encourage as much as possible is for groups to keep what I call decision logs. And it's a really, I try to convince them to take a simple approach and use an Excel spreadsheet with 3 columns that list out the topic, what decision was made, and on what date. And that can just be a standing resource for the working group to refer back to at different intervals. And most importantly, the chair should be really familiar with that document so that as he or she hears topics that are being raised that have already been closed, he or she can redirect the group away from them. So this helps also, again, get new participants up to speed and understand what kind of conversations have happened in the group that's not captured by the meeting minutes typically.
So Greg, so how do these work with the meeting minutes? How are the two complementary to one another?
What I usually recommend is that any decisions, well, frankly, the meeting minutes, should be a very succinct summary of the meeting. Secondly, I like to have dedicated areas of the meeting minutes where you have both a summary list of the action items assigned during the meeting and a summary list of the decisions made during the meeting. And then those are usually then transposed into a master file for decisions and a master file for action items. So they're usually pretty closely connected.
Thanks.
Systems definitely matter. I almost proposed having 2 slides on this topic just because it's so important. Within any organization, and particularly within a technical working group, it's absolutely critical that you establish and also maintain a uniform system for document storage, for ballot tracking, for discussions, and any other official business that happens within a working group. And I've seen time and again so many groups just rely on email to push materials out and to have conversation. While there's certainly a place for email, you want to make sure that if you have an email system in place, that there are archives that are available to your members and, again, to new participants as they get into the organization. The other thing to consider, that as much as you have a collaboration tool that offers document storage and voting, et cetera, you want to make sure that you're using it and that you're using it consistently across all working groups, and that the structure and the approach in using those tools is consistent across the organization. And what I like to remind my technical leaders is think of your organization from the perspective of a brand new person from an organization that joins your association and wants to get plugged into the activities, and imagine what it would be like for that person if every working group that they looked into had a completely different document structure and a completely different way of working, and some groups used just email and some groups used file systems. It would be chaos and it would be completely disorienting, and yet that's how some organizations still work. So define a system that works for your organization, make sure that aligns with your rules of procedure, and then just make sure that you stick to it and really reinforce its usage. We've spent a lot of time today talking about conference calls and the daily work of technical working groups, but there has to be a realization that conference calls can only go so far in making or allowing progress of working groups. Maybe more so than other parts of an association, technical working groups simply make a lot of progress during face-to-face meetings. And there's a couple reasons for this. Number one, technical content tends to go pretty deep, and there's generally a limit of how effective phone or even web-based conversations can be in allowing people to digest and communicate very technical topics. It's also worthy of consideration that, especially today with generally global participation across many of our groups, there's a lot of participants that don't speak English as a native language, and it can be that much harder for them to really understand and keep pace with the conversations that are happening. So bringing everyone on a regular basis into an in-person meeting can have an awful lot of benefit. That being said, we also like to encourage a good use of time at those face-to-face meetings. While I'm a firm believer that conference calls are a great way for participants to share ideas and to start presenting new technical topics, I see face-to-face meetings as the ideal environment in which a group can make decisions and really make sure that whether you have consensus or a unanimous approach, that's the place in the forum to do it, because trying to do those kinds of far-reaching decisions via conference call can be really challenging.
You know, the other piece for face-to-face meetings is important it is to have a very robust formal agenda. It's also important to have a little bit of time for people to connect and really build relationships. So many technical working groups are comprised of organizations that are competitors and organizations that have very different agendas on things. It's important to build some relationships with folks, and those are often done at the face-to-face meetings, at a baseball game, at a bar, at just talking around at a break, and that becomes the reservoir of goodwill that helps an organization get through some of the times of disagreement.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it is absolutely critical that the work of the technical working group, or multiple if your organization has those, stays in alignment with what the board of directors is doing and the general direction of the organization. And I've witnessed over the course of my career many examples where a board of directors will charter a technical working group. That group goes off and, over a lengthy period of time to create deliverables and documents and standards, et cetera, only to come back after that length of time and have the board look at their material and say, well, gee, this isn't what we needed, or, gee, that's great that you've produced this, but, the market doesn't need this anymore. There really has to be a steady and ongoing conversation between each technical activity of the organization and the board of directors. The board really has to be tuned into the strategy and where the market is and where the market's heading, and make sure that the technical work aligns to that. And the technical working group really needs to keep the board apprised of progress against schedule, but also where the challenges lie in terms of reaching consensus or even meeting the full scope of work that it was chartered to do.
So with that, we come to two items. First, we can pause for just any questions that folks might have. We have a chat function on your screen. If you have questions, just enter them into the chat function, and we'd be happy to address them. So, Sheila, do we have any questions?
We do. How do you handle a difficult committee member that keeps blocking your progress?
Thanks, Sheila. A few different thoughts on that. First, it's helpful at times to have terms on a board, on a technical working group, and have opportunities for individuals to roll off. Another piece is to have some level of good standing requirements where somebody needs to be engaged in the technical working group and come to the right number of meetings, so that perhaps if they've missed 3 out of 5 meetings, they might not have the ability to vote on an issue. They might not have the, they might lose the ability to participate. Another is, frankly, just to have the honest dialogue with somebody on what are their concerns and what is their agenda for the organization. Get a better sense of, there are folks that join these groups, frankly, just to slow them down. Getting a better sense of that and getting a better sense of their interests is really quite critical. And finally, this is a place where the right rules of procedure can really come into place. Your rules of procedure should spell out what do you do if you get to a point where somebody does need to be removed from the group. Greg, any strategies that you've seen work?
Yeah, I would say that more than strategies, I just think that I've tended to see too many organizations just launch their working groups and not give it any more thought. And really, it's so important, not just across these 10 elements that we've laid out, but it's just really important to think about your working groups as part of your holistic operations of your organization, and to care and feed those activities, and not let them become the Wild West and do their own thing.
Yep, totally agree. Other questions, Sheila?
Do you have any practical suggestions for how to coach a weak chair?
Sure. A few things come to mind, but Greg, I'll let you lead this one off.
Yeah. Number one, if you don't have currently I'll call it a leadership training initiative in place, that might be a good trigger point to get one into place, because it allows your organization to define expectations of what you want out of a chair, and then use that, we'll call it a non-performing chair, as sort of the first wave of participation into that training initiative. The other thing I would advise is, generally in a standards organization, a chair is essentially assigned by one of the member organizations of the association, and it's generally a good idea to go back to the organization that assigned or appointed that chairperson and notify the lead of that organization that you have some concerns with that chair. But like any, I'll call it, a human resources situation, you really want to focus on the issue and not the person. And the person just may not have the right training, they may not have the right bandwidth or the right experience, and you really want to just be very clear about expectations and where they're falling short of those expectations, and make sure that you don't get into the trap of just looking at the person and feeling like they're not the solution. Because if you don't define what you want and how you want any chair to work, the next person that comes in might encounter the same problems.
Yeah, and I really encourage folks to take advantage of external resources that are out there. And two that come to mind are ASAE, the American Society of Association Executives, and they provide a range of training for individuals who are facilitating volunteer committees. But very much on point is the Society for Standards Professionals, SES-standards.org. They're a great resource. They have a lot of training programs that they offer, both in terms of publications, online training, and events. That would really be a great resource for an individual. That can often give somebody both education in how to facilitate and how to run a technical working group meeting, but also a broader base of knowledge in how the standards development process works, and that's often quite critical.
Okay. How do you justify the cost of a face-to-face meeting from the general fund if the group is highly dispersed and doesn't include the entire dues-paying organization?
Well, I think that you justify that with just the cost of slower progress can often be more. The opportunity cost on if an organization isn't able to get its work done, and that's particularly in the model that's described, kind of diffuse model, is often much higher, and that's something which is hard to quantify, and organizations struggle with that. But when you do look at it and say, geez, getting this done is going to take 10 more meetings of 20 professionals, 2 hours each, that's a pretty significant opportunity cost of engineering time and engineering talent on something.
Yeah, and around the just getting the right participation at face-to-face meetings, it can certainly be hard. A lot of the groups that we work with do some sort of rotation if they have a global membership. If they meet multiple times in a year, doing a rotation across geographies or regions tends to be a good practice. If a group, say, only meets once a year, sometimes you do a multi-year rotation. But you also just have to be cognizant of the the profile and distribution of your membership. And if you have, let's say, 95% of your membership in North America and 5% of your membership elsewhere, it might be most logical to keep having your meetings in North America just because that's where the majority of your membership base is.
Okay. From an organizational standpoint, what drives participants to remain active contributors?
From my experience, there's a couple of elements there. First, well-run working groups tend to retain participants. It's where working groups tend to drift, where meetings are not tight, where decisions aren't getting made, people don't follow up on actions. Those just are generally environments where people would rather spend their time elsewhere. The other thing that I've seen is making sure that the scope and the work of a technical working group is closely aligned with the mission of the organization and what its goals are in the industry that it serves. And the more closely those two activities are linked, generally you'll get a higher profile level of participant and a more active, engaged participant, because you can also influence the organizations or the members of your association to put good technical people on projects that mean something to the industry. It gets that much harder when you're dealing with standards that aren't that relevant to the industry, or they've been around for a while and they're now into maintenance mode, and it's just not where the member companies want to put their best people.
Okay. Have you been successful in recruiting chairs or vice chairs who serve as chasers, or does that job normally fall to staff liaisons?
We've seen some chairs that are good at that, for sure. At times that can be an awkward position for a chair. So optimally, I would try to avoid putting a chair in that position. You want to have the chair be more of an honest broker and somebody who is focused on a bigger picture. But we have seen some chairs that can do that. That said, I think that's a great role for staff or secretariat function to really drive that externally.
Yeah, and Sheila, I agree with Andy, and this gets back a little bit to the last question. One way that organizations can help maintain active involvement is to take some of the administrative burden off of their technical representatives. And when they feel like they're in the organization but tending to do a lot of administration and minute taking and task tracking, et cetera, they start feeling conflicted and start drifting away. Companies like ours and other organizations that have their own staff, particularly for technical working groups that are chartered to move quickly and get results done quickly, it's generally a good idea to provide some level of staffing to just help keep the operational elements flowing smoothly.
Okay, and our final question, what is the most common mistake you see technical working groups make?
I would say perhaps not the most common mistake operationally, but what I've seen over the course of my involvement in standards organizations. So maybe it's not the most common mistake, but it's the most maybe serious mistake, is a lack of alignment between the mission and the scope of the overall organization and the work that the technical working group is doing. In our world, there is absolutely nothing worse than a technical working group spending a lot of time and a lot of resource developing a standard that at the end of the process, the industry doesn't want or need, and no one ends up adopting it. And so, it happens from time to time, and sometimes, there's nothing you can do about it. But for a lot of organizations, when you start peeling back the onion of why it happened, it was because there wasn't that alignment between the technical working group and the board, and there wasn't that ongoing steady conversation between those two bodies. And I think, I've seen that a lot in my career, but I've also seen the serious ramifications of that not happening. And that's something that we spend a lot of time trying to coach our client organizations to make sure that they do on a regular basis.
And I would completely agree with Greg. There's nothing more discouraging for everybody than when a technical working group votes an item up to the board, and the board says, "What the heck is this?" this isn't what we were expecting at all, and rejects it. That's discouraging for the central working group that feels like they worked hard on something, and discouraging for the board that's saying, geez, I guess we charged the wrong people with our activity. So you're really taking every step you can take to keep things in step and keep things in lockstep is so critical. And with that, we come to the end of our webinar, but not the end of our discussion. Our contact information is on the screen. We are happy to catch up with folks by email, Skype, phone, whatever is appropriate. Always happy to kibitz about these issues, and certainly no charge to do so, and delighted to kind of help groups find their success and find their most efficient way of doing things. With that, thank you very much for joining us on behalf of everyone at Virtual. We appreciate your time today.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, and have a good day.